Great. So let's have a round of introductions from first our visiting scholars. Pavel?
Yeah. My name is Pavel Luzin. I'm long-standing visiting scholar here, and my focus of research is Russian military sector.
Mikhail.
Hello, my name is Mikhail Troitsky, and I'm based at the Davis Center at Harvard. Here, I am a visiting professor for this semester teaching contemporary Russian foreign policy. So I feel sorry if you are not part of our class, but yeah, any other way I can be helpful.
Excellent. And Lilia. Yes.
Hi, Lilia Casanova. It's very nice to be here this semester. I'm doing research on international law of cyberspace, but specifically Russian approach to cyberspace regulation, internet regulation, civilizational narrative in cyberspace that Russia is pursuing. So, and I'm going to be talking end of this month, October 22nd. So you're welcome, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to chat. Yeah.
Great. And we will have another visiting scholar with us remotely, Vitaly Shkliarov, who's from Belarus, and he is conducting research on the 2020 protests in Belarus against the Lukashenko regime for a book that he is writing. Let's introduce some of our student employees. Just raise your hands and I'll call on you. Rylan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rylan Pitts. I'm a State Department fellow here, first-year mold student, and just joined the team. So if you have questions about the program, I'd be happy to help you find your answers.
Great. Rylan is part of our events admin team. Rupam is taking pictures, so I'll call on you.
My name is Rupam. I'm a second year MIT student. I'm working as a communication associate, marketing studies, technology and policy.
Great. Grace over there.
Hi, so I'm also one of the second year students. I'm also one of the State Department fellows. I'm working as the event coordinator for Arik's team and very excited to meet everyone.
Great. Nayan.
Hi everyone, my name is Nayan. I'm a second year MGA. I work for the program as a senior staff writer and editor. I've been here for more than a year working with Arik. We have a great team. Get involved. It's the best program we have here. Not because I'm part of it, but generally speaking. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, we have a former visiting scholar in the room, Oleg Shakirov. I figure we should introduce you. Oleg researches US-Russia cyber diplomacy, and he's visiting us. So glad to have you join us as always. Is there anyone I missed? Natasha, of course.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Wood. I work with Arik at the program, and I also run the Eurasia Club. So we'll be doing lunches like this throughout the course of the semester on a range of topics. And just to plug that if there are issues that you think we should be covering or talking about during our lunch sessions, then we'd love to hear them.
Excellent. So every Tuesday of the semester, almost, we have a few exceptions, from 12 to 1:30 at the program conference room. We have a very active speaker series with scholars and practitioners on various regional issues. And of course, you're all invited. The Eurasia Club also has a WhatsApp group, and you're welcome to sign up. The program is very active on social media. You'll find us on X at Fletcher Russia. We have a website, sites.tufts.edu/Fletcher Russia. It's on the banner. And we also have a LinkedIn account and an Instagram account. So there are many different ways to get information about upcoming activities, events, initiatives that the program is putting together. Let's go ahead and start our conversation. So while the American public is not particularly focused on international affairs traditionally, the presidential election next month will determine whose foreign policy the United States will pursue over the next 4 years. How do the worldviews of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris differ? And how might they approach the Russia-Ukraine war and US-China technology competition? And of course, tonight we have the vice presidential debate. So this conversation is very timely. Dan, I will turn it over to you for opening remarks, and we will have Chris speak briefly, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A with all of you. So,
Thank you, Arik. I mean, you know, the differences between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are pretty clear cut. Kamala Harris, you know, in terms of dealing with Russia, you know, Kamala Harris looks at Russia and sees an aggressor state that needs to be vigorously combated. Donald Trump is a force for peace and is going to end the war in Ukraine in a single day. On January 20th, 2021, if elected, he has promised that he's going to end the war in a single day. And I think we should take him to no. I think the way I would put it is that it's worth noting that both in her acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention and in the debate that she had with Donald Trump, Kamala Harris was extremely energetic about two issues. The first was abortion, but the second was actually foreign policy. I would argue this is where she was definitely the most passionate in terms of arguing with Trump about. And, you know, she looks at Russia and sees Russia as an actor that is attempting to subvert US democracy and an attempt, you know, in a country that wants to subvert the democracy of allies. Donald Trump looks at Russia, and the generous way I would put it is that I think Trump looks at it and thinks, we really want to be opposing China. And why are we pushing Russia towards China? We should find a way to have Russia be on our side. And then there's a whole personal psychodrama between Trump and Putin. And I'm not going to get into that too much, but needless to say, Trump clearly wants to keep saying that he views Putin as a friend, and therefore, you know, if he gets elected, it's pretty clear he believes that he can use control over US aid to Ukraine to force Ukraine to sign a deal that would obviously be relatively advantageous to Russia, but would also presumably have the advantage of ending the war somehow. I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I don't think there's much deeper than that in terms of the differences between the two.
Well, I was hoping you were going to tell us who's going to win the presidential election, but that's not really in here.
I can do that if you want, but like, you know, it's worth as much as you're paying for it.
well, I guess, you know, it's always difficult to interpret exactly how Trump's social media posts relate to Trump administration policy. In the first term, it was, you know, complex relationship. But I guess if you listen to the people who would like top jobs in foreign policy in the Trump administration, you know, I think what you find is a slightly different story than the one you've laid out.
Okay.
So, you know, I would point, for example, to Robert O'Brien's essay in Foreign Affairs from a month or so ago, and Pompeo has been on the record repeatedly embracing a slightly different strategy, which the way they would describe it is first build leverage and then negotiate. And when you ask them, well, how are you going to build leverage? They would say two things. They have said two things. One would be to give Ukraine a lot longer range munitions, which the Biden administration has been sort of doing it over a slow expansion, but they do more. And second, they both said, interestingly, impose tougher sanctions. Which I think is surprising in some ways to hear them say, but they've both said it. And I think their theory of the case is that if you want to end the war, you end the war both by encouraging Ukrainians to come to the table, but also by forcing or at least ramping up pressure on Russia to come to the table. And so although Trump hasn't really articulated that, although he did actually in his recent Washington Post interview, that kind of strategy, he articulated many different strategies. And so it's hard to ascertain which one he himself would adopt. But I think his advisors, if they are in fact the advisors we'll see, have a different strategy than what you've outlined.
I think that's fair, but this points out to the real uncertainty when it comes to Trump in terms of what he can do, which is are O'Brien and Pompeo going to be his principal advisors? You know, are they going to be appointed to the cabinet? I can see how Pompeo would be the Secretary of Defense, for example. The Secretary of State is just a complete wild card. I mean, it could be O'Brien. I could spin a story where it's Rick Grinnell, and that would lead to some very different outcomes in terms of what we would see.
Do you think? Like, I think Rick Grinnell has not been on the record on this issue.
You know, Grinnell is. How do I put this gently? It doesn't matter what he says on the record. It doesn't matter what he says off the record. Rick Grinnell is going to do whatever Trump wants him to do. I am skeptical that Grinnell would actually have any independent intellectual power in terms of I confess I'm biased here because my own interactions with Grinnell over time have led me to this conclusion. But that's
not bias. That's information.
Yeah, that's information.
Inside scoop.
But I think the other thing is that what it highlights is, I think the really, if Trump gets elected, and in terms of, who's gonna win, like, it's obviously in some ways a toss-up, it depends on the margin of error, but right now I'd much rather be Kamala Harris.
All right, you heard it here first. You heard it here first.
So that's the way I look at it. But, the problem with Trump is that the variance in terms of what he might do is so much wider. For two reasons. The first is that in contrast to his first term, he's not going to be appointing people that are going to be checking him necessarily. They're not going to be the adults in the room. At best, they're going to ignore him, and at worst, they're going to enable him. And also, if he wins, he's going to have a Congress that is likely going to be a GOP majority, and a Congress that is going to be much Trumpier than the GOP circa 2017. And so in some ways, he's going to be less constrained in terms of what he wants to do. Now, you're right that if Trump's bargaining strategy in his first term is very clear, which is that, it's a whole bunch of bellicose threats. He'll try to pursue maximum pressure and then cut the first deal that is offered to him as a way of indicating, see, what a great bargaining, what a great bargainer I am. So my hunch is that I could see him thinking in that direction. But I think the moment Putin suggests a summit or something, and it says, look, let's just agree that the four of us, we've, annexed our ours and we'll leave it at that, I suspect Trump will go for that.
You think Russia would go for that? See, my perception now is that Russia thinks it's winning.
Right.
Thinks time is on its side. The goal is regime change. In 2023, that doesn't look realistic.
So I'm going to defer to you in terms of the state of the battlefield, but what I would suggest is that it partially depends on what the rump Ukraine would be allowed to do. Presumably, the thing that he would demand was that the rump Ukraine could, that Ukraine could never join NATO or could not join, and there would be limits in terms of arms being sent to Ukraine. Again, I think Trump would take that deal.
To me, the question of, I think, the territorial settlement, one can agree to disagree about territory. We saw that East West Germany, North South Korea. That seems like a resolvable issue in a negotiation. The real challenge is what remains of Ukraine independent or not?
Right.
And that was the point of the war on the Russian side, was to make Ukraine not independent, or make Ukrainians recognize they weren't independent. Ukrainians, of course, would prefer to be independent. And so the question is, are there security guarantees that make Ukraine's independence credible, or
the answer to that is no, because there were security guarantees given to Ukraine prior to this war. We can go back to the Budapest Declaration, we can go back to, the Russian Federation's recognition of Ukraine as a sovereign country. If you're the Ukrainians, you have to accept any kind of security guarantee coming from Russia. I think the best case in a world where Trump is president that Ukraine could hope for would be a sort of Finlandization outcome in which Ukraine has some degree of domestic autonomy. They're able to do what they want in terms of development, but in terms of foreign policy, they are non-active. Now, the truth is that with respect to Putin, I'm not sure even that will work. Because in some ways you could argue that there were a variety of reasons why Russia invades Ukraine, but one of them is undeniably that Ukraine was a Slavic state that actually was a relatively vibrant democracy compared to Russia. In some ways, that represented a falsification of Putin's claim that Western-style democracy would never work. And so one of the interesting questions is that if you were able to somehow, cut this deal, would Putin be okay with it? Or more likely, he would be okay with it for now, and then a couple of years from now, you would see, a more aggressive action.
Well, I guess when I look at the security guarantee question, it seems to me that the history of the Budapest Memorandum that we now know was that the Ukrainians asked for guarantees, and the US said, all right, we'll give you fake guarantees as long as everyone knows that they're fake. And there was diplomacy that was designed on making sure everyone realized that they were not serious guarantees.
Except the public.
Except the public. Yeah. Here's Article 5, and here's where you're. And so I guess the question is there a scenario in which Ukraine could actually get plausible security guarantees? And then you ask, well, what are the credible guarantees? NATO. Well, that's not going to happen. Even though it seems like there are former Biden administration officials who are now pushing let's do the West German version of NATO. Non-occupied Ukraine gets in, you draw the line where it is, and the rest of Ukraine stays outside. How do you actually implement that while a war is going on? Very tricky. And would Russia
That's never going to get implemented. I have serious doubts about that.
NATO expanded under the Trump administration.
True, but it was not NATO.
Yeah, I think we're right after a Russian-backed coup attempt.
Right.
So it's curious. So option one is NATO. Hard for me to see that path. Option two is, could you have bilateral US security guarantees that were made credible with force deployments?
And interestingly enough, this is actually what Trump has preferred to do, and what he said he wants to do in terms of Eastern Europe. You know, when he's talked about the US withdrawing from NATO, he has also followed up with the idea of, well, we would offer bilateral guarantees to countries that are actually paying their fair share, like Poland or what have you. So there is a logic saying that this is, you know, potentially what he would be attracted to.
Yes, Ukraine, to its credit, is above 2% of GDP.
Yes.
So the option two, I think, would the US public be willing to do a sort of Korea-style force deployment? I don't know about that one. That seems also politically challenging.
I think that is, look this way, if again, I am dubious of the likelihood that Trump would go for this, but in a situation where Trump would go for it, it is a sort of Nixon goes to China moment, where Trump, if he's for it, I suspect Democrats would not. I mean, Democrats might oppose it in the sense of it puts U.S. troops at risk, or put, you know, it's actually, you know, increases the likelihood of a risk to the U.S. military. But in the end, I suspect that if Trump were actually vigorously supported, it would go.
Yeah, because we're thinking in Korea, we agreed to it because we ran the Korean army.
Right.
Right. We forced them into our command structures to make sure they wouldn't do something bad, and that was part of the deal. Basically, you need to restrain your ally to make sure that you're in charge of because otherwise they have a moral hazard problem. So with the Ukrainians agreed to that, really complex arrangement. Because option three is there a level of defense armament that would give Ukraine the ability to deter a future Russian attack?
Well, this is where, and again, I would be happy to defer to you and or security experts. I mean, this is where Ukraine trying to get the permission to use long-term, you know, missiles. And we've seen some pretty spectacular strikes without those missiles by Ukraine itself on Russian military depots. It does raise an interesting question in terms of whether Ukraine can establish deterrence without nuclear weapons. Yeah, would be the way to think about it. And indeed, I think that's part of the reason why you've seen the acute reaction by Putin over the recent weeks in terms of saying we are now, you know, in terms of changing military doctrine, in terms of changing nuclear doctrine. I think, unfortunately, this is an area, by the way, where the problem is that Russia has drawn so many red lines that have been completely ignored by the West. That even if they mean this next red line, I don't think the West is going to interpret it as having any significance. In fact, Bill Burns, the CIA, you know, Joe Biden, Kirk Sherman, they've all been very clear about this in terms of saying, yeah, they said a lot of this stuff. So, you know, this is the one thing that makes me nervous in the sense of, is there a moment where Putin actually means it? I don't think so, but I can't, you know, I cannot claim to be on the mind of Vladimir Putin.
But I guess if you actually meant it, you would, you know, that's obviously basically rhetoric, only rhetoric. So you do a test or something which would violate treaties and obviously anger your friends.
And as I understand it, this is what Russian hawks want. They want some version of a test demonstrate, you know, a test explosion to suggest that he's being serious. On the other hand, I also think that's one of the few things where, you know, China, who's his most important strategic ally, would start actually vigorously objecting.
I would China care. So what? China, by the way, is also massively building up its nuclear arsenal.
China's massively building up its nuclear arsenal, but the one instant, if you take a look at, like, you know, how China dealt with this invasion, they've obviously tried to be studiously neutral, and more recently, as you pointed out, among others, been willing to, you know, trade with Russia. But the one area where they've been publicly, at least, vehement about is a nuclear. And I think a test explosion would cross that.
So suppose Kamala wins.
Yeah.
Vice President Harris wins. What does that imply for the war? I guess my sense is that she would pursue the same strategy that Biden has pursued, which is a strategy that keeps Ukraine in the war, but also doesn't look, I think, unfortunately, likely to.
I think the key thing with a Harris victory is to what degree you see a change in personnel. There was an interesting story, I think, that NBC News reported over the weekend, suggesting that an awful lot, that part of the problem Harris would have is that the one thing you can say is pretty likely at this point is that Republicans will control the Senate after the election. You know, Democrats would have to run the table in terms of winning all their defended seats. And right now, Montana doesn't look great for them. So there's a couple of other possibilities, but they're pretty marginal possibilities. And I think their concern is, are they going to be in a situation where they can't get their, you know, nominees for various cabinet and sub-cabinet officials confirmed? And so it's likely that you would see undersecretaries and deputy secretaries maybe being asked to stay on. I think Bill Burns is going to be asked to stay on. Would be, my hunch. The one thing that's been made clear is I think Harris wants to choose a woman to be Secretary of Defense. So I suspect Lloyd Austin, and Austin of all of them is the one that has the sort of singular tie to Biden. But I think you would see a new Secretary of State, and I think you'd see a new Defense Secretary. So there'd be a change in personnel. I don't know whether Harris would, as I said, like she characterizes, I think, similar to Biden. But at the same time, I do wonder whether the fact that she would take over would give her a political opportunity to change tack somewhat in terms of sort of setting overarching goals and pointing out that once again, China is a bigger threat than Russia from the U.S. perspective. Are there ways to cajole Europe to do more on this front, and so on and so forth?
Do more meaning.
In terms of providing material, yeah, exactly, and budgetary support and so forth. But that said, that's speculation. It's worth noting that in all likelihood, if Harris wins, the National Security Advisor will be Phil Gordon. Phil Gordon's about as much of an Atlanticist as you can get. And so I strongly suspect that there would not be that much deviation in the way of U.S. support for Russia.
It is for Ukraine, and it seems like and it seems like the Europeans,
Drezner going senile.
So regardless of what the Europeans do, it won't really matter relative to what the US does. Like if Germany increases or decreases by 10%, probably not going to change.
Probably not, although this is where European elections wind up making, creating some interesting issues. Yeah. Which is to say, if you have, follow-up elections like what happened in Austria, for example. Yeah. And suddenly Europeans start to wobble in terms of support for Ukraine. That's where, if nothing else, I think that's a situation where U.S. support for Ukraine becomes less politically popular. Yeah. Harris is a politician just like anyone else, so she might react.
So it seems to me that the election that really matters is the German election, where actually, you might argue that Olaf Scholz is wobbler in chief. Yeah. But Scholz is very interesting. He said Ukraine will not lose. Not exactly Churchillian. And the U.S. has at times embraced Ukraine will win as a goal. Certainly the Poles, the Balts, and the Czechs and whatnot, Romanians, the Scandinavians, British, they're in the win category. Macron, of course, is hard to interpret as former President Trump in his statements. But it seems like actually Schultz will be out in the October elections, if not sooner, and this EU will be in with Merz at the helm. And so I do wonder actually whether you end up with a more pro-Ukraine German polity, even though you've got the FDP and AfD.
That's possible. And again, that makes Harris's job easier. Again, U.S. public opinion on all of this is always U.S. does something with allied support, that is always all else equal more popular. It's if the U.S. is seen as acting unilaterally in a situation where there's no end, that's a problem. And this is the one thing in terms of public opinion for the United States that I do worry about, which is I don't know what Harris's theory of victory is. Right. Well, the problem is Trump, say what you will, has a theory of victory. I think it's Lincoln theory of victory, but it's a theory of victory. I think for Harris, the interesting question, and this might be at some point a sort of philosophical divide between more realpolitik foreign policy advisors versus liberal ones. If you're a liberal foreign policy advisor, you want Ukraine to win for a whole variety of reasons. If you're a realpolitik policy advisor, there is some incentive. I mean, you don't want Ukraine to lose, but you might be willing to allow the war to simply continue because achieving victory is going to be that much harder. I mean, it's not like achieving victory is just a couple of weapon systems away. It's going to be fantastically difficult for Ukraine to win this war. And the advantage of an ongoing war is you are grinding up Russia's, military capacity. They're pretty much exhausted their Soviet, stockpile. They're going to have to start, they obviously
grinding up North Korea.
They're grinding up North Korea, exactly. So, there's a way in which, from a strictly realpolitik relative gains perspective, there's value in having Russia burn through all of its stock.
So this is a really interesting question because I think if you get some Biden folks quietly off the record to admit it to themselves and say do you think the status quo is basically fine because the costs are basically borne by first Ukraine, which is tragic, second by Russia, and third, costs of the US are rounding error in the context of the federal budget.
Well, no, apparently we can't do anything in North Carolina or Georgia because I'm just kidding. This is the official. This is the GOP.
I'm not as tuned into
Yeah.
the Twitter debates, so I miss the political scandals of the day.
This is why you're more cogent than I am.
So option one is like actually it's sort of depressing,
Yeah.
but like US strategy in Afghanistan in the
Right.
80s, you're gonna have this long mess. So but option two is actually it takes a lot of mental bandwidth from senior leaders to focus on this issue, to deal with the nuclear threats, to cajole the Italians. Can you please spend more than 1.3% of GDP on your defense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And wouldn't you rather spend the time, pivoting to Asia as President Obama promised to do 15 years ago and we haven't actually done yet? That type of thing. Isn't the bandwidth question actually kind of relevant?
It is, but I don't know if there's a way that there's no artful way out of this. I mean, this is one of the things you learn. Every president eventually learns when they take office. They think they can choose which issues they want to focus on, and inevitably the issues choose them. We're dealing with a Biden administration where Biden's express goal was to heavily reduce the US footprint in the Middle East. And look where we are.
Was it Harold Wilson said events do boy events? Yes. All right, well, already 4 minutes over our allotted time, and Arik has ordered us to leave time for questions. So if you'd like to know who's going to win the presidential election or individual senatorial elections, other types of prognostications, I'm sure Dan knows the answer. Please.
From a Ukrainian perspective, if you're sitting in Kiev right now and you're a policymaker, what do you want to do in the next 3 months on the battlefield to make a case, irrespective of who comes to power in the US, but to make a case maybe to European capitals, if not the US, to keep the support going? What they should do right now to keep the interest and the support that they have right now to continue even beyond January?
I guess my sense is that they're in wait and see mode, like the rest of the world. They're going to wait to see the U.S. election, wait to see the key appointments, especially if Trump wins, if there's more uncertainty as to who the appointments will be and what their policies will be, and then try to figure out what the strategy is after that. But I think, as we discussed, if you have a Trump victory, there's a real chance that U.S. strategy changes in different directions, but a real chance it changes. And if you're Ukraine, you have to respond to that. That could have some negatives and some positives depending on the change. If it's Harris, you probably don't have strategy change, I don't think, or if it changes beyond the margin, yes.
Also, the next 3 months don't matter.
Next 3 months don't matter.
You just want to make sure you've got a policy.
Yeah. And so I think that's what everyone is waiting for. Same for the Russians, I think.
Just to tack on to that question, Volodymyr Zelensky met with Trump and Harris and Biden last week, and of course there was a lot of speculation about whether he would meet with Trump. So I wonder if he achieved his aims of the visit, given that it seems like he's building a personal relationship with Trump that may help Ukraine if Trump were to be elected.
I'm not sure I would describe, let's put it this way, the victory for Zelensky was that Trump wanted to meet with him in some ways. That was the key thing, because the very fact that Trump felt it was necessary to have that meeting suggests that maybe he won't necessarily turn off if he needs to be selected. As in terms of the personal relationship, I have no idea what Zelensky thinks about Trump, but more coming.
So if Gross, first year PhD, if President Trump wins as a non-traditional politician and an elderly politician, how do you see the decision-making structure change for his second administration? And what decisions could you see maybe radically shifting away from where we would see somebody who is more beholden to their power party? More beholden, is there lineage concerns, vanity concerns, anything along those lines? And do you see that altering his decision-making during his second administration?
First of all, let's remember that this man was president for 4 years, so it's not like he's coming to this without any, experience whatsoever. In terms of legacy, he's already made his legacy choice, and that was J.D. Vance. He might be regretting that legacy choice now, but he's nonetheless made it. And J.D. Vance is not going to go gentle into that good night. So, and particularly foreign policy is one of the areas where Vance has articulated what he believes is sort of a distinct, novel GOP way of doing it. I think the key thing to understand about Trump in his second term is that towards the end of his first term, he was just finally starting to figure out how to operate the levers of power. And I think he's going to want to essentially create a new system whereby he has no guardrails that he has to worry about, because it took him 4 years to figure out how to navigate those things in his first term. What this means is that you're going to see a lot more policy by whim. I don't think he's going to get briefed terribly well. I don't think he's going to respond to the briefings terribly well. And also, I don't know if you've heard him speak recently. He's not the same guy that he was in 2016. You know, so the variance of possible outcomes with a Trump presidency is wider than it was his first
term. Hello. Hi, David Momch, first year Mold student. One of the questions I wanted to ask was, in the broader context of the conflict between the United States, Russia, and the upcoming elections, I was wondering if you can speak to Eurasian issues, particularly about what the implications of either the Harris presidency or the Trump presidency has for broader regional Eurasian issues, like in the South Caucasus and in Central Asia. While I know that's of secondary or even tertiary importance to American grand strategy, I was wondering if any of the candidates really have any broader implications for these areas that are slowly beginning to pull themselves out of the Russian orbit as well.
I think the election that really matters in South Caucasus, the Georgian election, coming up in 3 weeks now. You know, that will have, I think, very interesting implications. There's a chance we have a winner. There's also a chance we don't have a recognized winner of that election, and you've got domestic protests. It's hard to see how that could evolve, but it could evolve in, I think, really interesting and destabilizing ways. So I think worth following that very closely. I think in the US that has not registered as an interesting election, but I think it really could be.
The other Georgia.
Yeah, the other Georgia. Yes, pardon me. The other Georgia. Exactly, South Caucasus. Georgia, the other one. But that's an interesting one where neither president's candidate has, as far as I'm aware, strong views on Georgia. Like that will be
that's a safe
that will be resolved by the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy will set the policy on that type of issue, and so whoever wins, I think you're going to have basically the same result, and it'll be resolved first under the Biden administration and the initial response. But please,
the one thing I would say is that Trump winning provides an opportunity, not so much for Georgia, but for other Central Asian actors. I'm thinking of Azerbaijan in particular, maybe Kazakhstan a little bit, and Turkey, to engage in what you might call pay for play in terms of foreign policy. You know, we saw this in terms of Turkey during the first Trump administration. And you know, it seems pretty obvious that they might be attempting, I can see a scenario whereby some of these, countries, if there's a second Trump term, believe that they can find someone within the administration that is for hire, as it were, in a way that would not be the case under the Harris administration.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, professors. I have just a couple of points and the question. So I think we might be overlooking the issue of sanctions. So Russia wants sanctions removed. It wants sanctions removed. It was one of the demands that Putin set forth when he kind of laid out his peace plan, basically saying we want the 4 regions and the removal of sanctions. And then echoing Putin in a very strange way, Erdogan also said Russia needs sanctions removed. So I guess to the question that one of you raised, whether Russia is willing to kind of sue for peace, I guess Russia would set that as a condition if it's not falling apart. Immediately, if it still believes it can win, it will demand that the sanctions are removed. But my question to you is, what do you make of the territorial adjustment and of the legal side of the territorial adjustment if it is ever to kind of be implemented on the ground? So, and it goes to the heart of the question about recognizing annexation. So Russia would say, okay, we make a deal, but then we want Ukraine to recognize these 4 regions as part of the Russian Federation, as they are written into the Russian Constitution. Now, if Ukraine is serious about kind of suing for peace, Ukraine would probably have to think about it. So imagine Ukraine recognizes those regions as part of Russia, and then what does the United States do in this situation? Does the United States follow suit, or the United States just says, well, it's because it's not even the GDR versus FRG, because Ukraine is not going to be FRG fully protected by the Western allies. So, but recognizing annexations in the contemporary world is going to be a very, very big deal from my perspective, right? And then finally, also, what do you make of the Trump actually pivoting from just completely Russia and Zelensky aside during his visit, and Mike Johnson saying Zelensky should fire the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, and then within a few hours Trump says he's ready to meet with Zelensky, and then during the meeting apparently says he is not letting Ukraine up or something like that. So why did Trump change his mind? Is there really something to gain? No, I mean, I think it was political. His advisor told him you have to.
It's possible someone told him there are a lot of Eastern European immigrants that live in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. I'm just spitballing there. There was a reason why when during the first presidential debate, Harris talked about Polish Americans, in Pennsylvania. And so, yeah, I think the answer is that someone told him politically it would be worth indicating that you're going to be perhaps a little tougher and your support of Ukraine.
I think it's probably a meaningful data point that Mike Johnson did not criticize Zelensky. He found someone much less relevant to criticize. Just on the assumption that he's a political animal, I think that was not a coincidence. And that he's doing his best, I think, to thread a stated desire to continue supporting Ukraine militarily with a recognition of what J.D. Vance and others recognize as a wing of the Republican Party that doesn't want to do that. And it strikes me that he's been very careful in that regard, but managed to keep both parts together. On the annexation question, I mean, it seems to me that if the more that Russia were to potentially get in a potential deal, the more that Ukraine would demand a potential deal. And so I think if you were to envision all of the West, as well as Ukraine, recognizing territorial changes, I think you'd also imagine that Ukraine's demand on the security guarantee side would be even greater.
I can't see it getting to that. I mean, I would assume that any deal is going to consist of Russia keeping the territories, but no one necessarily recognizing.
Yeah, a halfway deal rather than a full deal seems, On sanctions, I think I think sort of on the assumption that we've discussed, which is that if you get Trump, you have more variability of options. If you get Harris, you have much less variability. I think under Harris, it's hard to imagine sanctions being lifted because a deal is hard to imagine. And so therefore, why would you have lifting of sanctions? Whereas under Trump, I think more will be potentially on the table to deal. And I think there would be recognition that sanctions would be part of that negotiation.
I think it'd be fair to describe your projection of Harris administration as more of the same and an exhaustion strategy. But is that really a good idea? Is it really going to work? Russia is pretty well established in independent economic existence. It's establishing its own bilateral economic relations, military supply relations. Should the Harris administration consider a change in course, and what should it be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I look at this is who's attriting faster, Russia or Ukraine. Economically, we know that Ukraine has suffered vastly more than Russia. In terms of numbers of forces lost, I think there's been plenty of losses on both sides. Who's got the capacity to replace? Certainly in terms of personnel, I think Russia's got more capacity to replace. And we'll see if they're willing to do another round of mobilization, if that happens later this year or next year. But population is 3 times larger, plus a big portion of Ukrainians are now living outside of Ukraine. All that means it's easier for Russia to replenish. And Russia's defense industry is not being attacked by missiles on a daily basis, whereas what remains of Ukraine's is. So all of that would make me think that Russia has the advantage in a war of attrition, which is exactly that's the strategy in Russia. And so I think that's a fair question to ask: is this in Ukraine's long run interest? I think if you're Vice President Harris or potentially future President Harris, again going back to our conversation, you might think, well, it's an unfortunate outcome, but is there a better outcome? And that's a tricky question to answer. Pompeo would say, yes, there is. Let's ramp it up and see if we can get a deal. There's risks, of course, if you ramp it up.
what would ramping up look like?
I'll get what Pompeo said publicly.
Yeah, I know what he said, but like, what actually would ramping up look like? I mean, beyond actually cutting Russia's energy exports off, I'm not sure what else there is that would somehow
Longer range strikes.
Oh, you mean on terms of this? Yeah, no, that's possible.
Yeah, and there's lots of long range missiles in the U.S. arsenal.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Right, and in the German arsenal, which Schultz very notably has declined to give. Would Schultz give those if Trump was twisting his arm?
I think a more artful way would, if you're Harris, would be not so much to give the U.S. missiles, but perhaps to get more covert technical support to make it easier for Ukraine to build missiles.
Yeah, and so I think if you think of the security guarantee strategy we discussed, 1, NATO, not going to happen. 2, bilateral guarantees with forced deployments, hard to imagine. 3, can Ukraine arm itself sufficiently? It doesn't seem that plausible for the U.S. to say give Ukraine 1,000 Tomahawks. But what if they transfer all the know-how?
Yeah.
Actually, Ukraine has its own very extensive missile building history.
Right.
And if peace were temporarily restored, a lot of that expertise, I think you could probably spin up into some pretty interesting defense industrial capabilities. I think that is an interesting question to start to think through.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, hi. I had a question regarding how much room to maneuver does a president in the US have to change foreign policy? Because you have vested interest with the military industrial complex, you have think tanks, you have the entrenched deep state of the bureaucracy, as they said. So as an outsider, a lot of people think that there is a vested interest to continue the war because it benefits the military industrial complex. It benefits a lot of sections within the establishment, the bureaucracy. So how much room to maneuver does the president actually have to really make a drastic change to US foreign policy? Be it the continuation of the current administration if Kamala Harris comes to power or if Trump comes to power.
So I've been struck by the fact that I wish the military industrial complex had more lobbying power than it does.
One of the interesting things is that actually it's the administration desperately trying to get the military industrial complex to ramp up what they're doing.
Tank artillery cells.
And
a busy day.
I would actually suggest that in point of fact, presidents have significant amounts of leeway. I think Trump would have more leeway than Harris, if for no other reason that it's a second Trump term, so he's not going to run again. Whereas Harris would obviously be seeking re-election, so there might be particular interest groups that she would be interested in catering to. On the other hand, and I cannot stress this enough, Americans fundamentally do not care about foreign policy. They really don't. And so the idea that you're going to see either candidate or if elected as president, change particular policy because they think that it's really going to appeal to a broad constituency of Americans. That's not going to happen. Because there's very little that would actually cause Americans to mobilize one way or the other when it comes to a particular policy. I mean, you're seeing micro-targeting right now, which is why you led the conversation about Polish Americans in Pennsylvania. But beyond that, I don't think this election is not going to be decided based on foreign policy. And I don't think the next president is not going to be constrained either way in terms of foreign policy.
Hi, sorry, Antonio, I'm part of the MATA program. I was just going to build on one of the earlier questions and ask how the Ukrainian people might react to a potential deal or, as was mentioned, the sort of recognition of annexations. So what would be the likelihood, for example, of potential unrest, especially in light of the fact that Ukrainians have been fighting now since 2022? It's been a sort of big part of their national narrative as well. So what are the risks of sort of civil unrest in that case?
I think it's really hard to know what the Ukrainian people would approve of in terms of a potential deal. You can look at public opinion polling, but I'm sort of skeptical as to the meaning of public opinion polling. There is, I think, relatively high quality polling being done of would you fight until X result or Y result was achieved, and all of those polls suggest a very strong willingness to fight. But I think that's more of a hypothetical willingness to fight rather than a statement of preferences around this or that shape of a deal. I think it's clear that the populace is very understandably tired of the war, would like it to end, but also wants it to end in a way that provides a durable peace. And so I think there's a lot of space in between those two preferences. And the task of a political leader, in this case Zelensky, is to find the space that would be tolerable for the Ukrainian people and also viable internationally. Is there space there? I don't know, but I think the constraints are going to be on the Russia-Ukraine dynamics rather than the Ukrainian domestic dynamics, would be my sense.
Nathan Jackaloni, a Malt student. I guess building off that question, looking towards potential end of the war, a potential victory scenario, if assuming best case scenario, some, if not all of the territory currently occupied by Russia happens to get reintegrated into Ukraine, what does the future of that look like? Because there's certainly elements within those regions that are sympathetic to Russia, if not outright supporting of them. What does a future for them in a post-war Ukraine look like, or is there even a future for them in a post-war Ukraine? And how would Ukraine go about potentially approaching them with an approach that's in line with international norms of human rights and following the law and those sorts of principles they're trying to adhere to?
I think to get to that type of scenario, like suppose Putin was hit by a bus tomorrow, it doesn't really change the dynamic of the Russian government keep fighting the war. So you need some sort of extraordinary, almost exogenous shock to the system on the Russian side to make that possible in the short run. And hard to know what's gonna happen in 2027, but I struggle to see that scenario materializing because I think the Russians have demonstrated they've got a fair amount of staying power.
Yeah. If it were to happen, I guess the other answer is that you probably have to have some degree of permissible migration of residents in those areas that are, would prefer to be part of Russia to essentially go there. It's worth remembering that when Russia invaded, you had significant outward migration from Ukrainians to the West. You also had about 1 million Ukrainians going into Russia as well. And so, that would be the other thing that would have to happen. But I do agree with Professor Miller that scenario is unlikely.
The population of the occupied territories is probably,
Pretty
a third of what it was previously.
Sorry, I have a question. Very simple. Two assumptions first. Suppose that the war would carry on for 6-7 years more, and suppose that Western states will not fall in love with the West. What will be the best interest of the United States, not Ukraine, not Russia, the United States, to happen by the 7-8 years, the coming ones?
You're talking about an implacably hostile Russia after a 7-year war.
Like by the end of 7 years. Let's imagine this.
Probably the best scenario for the United States would be continued outward brain drain from Russia, so that its overall economic capacity at the end of the war is considerably smaller than it was at the start of it. And also, ideally, what you would want would be a Russian state that has been penetrated by Western intelligence enough, so that you can get a pretty decent sense of what their plans are. So
In the future.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, I suppose the other thing you would hope for would be any other possible targets of Russian military aggression would essentially be stood up, and there'd be a porcupine strategy in place, a place like Moldova, for example. Because one of the things, and we talked about this in the sanctions conference, one of the things I'm legitimately concerned about is that even if the war were to end tomorrow, the Russian economy now is much more warlike than it was 3 years ago. And the cost of winding that down and essentially reviving the civilian sector, I fear is going to be more wrenching than people realize. And if that's the case, then that incentivizes the Russian state to continue to do things to basically keep Russia on war.
And regardless of whether the war actually ends or not, I mean, even if
just
it's a ceasefire, it will continue to be
It's striking a variety of primarily Northern European leaders and Eastern European leaders, the Danish Prime Minister, the head of the German army, have predicted a war between the European NATO members and Russia is possible by the end of the decade, which I think is worth thinking through pathways by which you might get there and might avoid that.
Avoiding that.
All right, so Rocky White's Professor of Maritime Studies. I want to ask if you think Trump has made foreign policy more of an issue by merging domestic policy and foreign policy. I'm thinking border policy, southern border policy, trade policy, and making a lot about how dollars, the $7 billion that Ukraine walked away with last week are being spent in North Carolina?
I would say that, there is a degree to which Trump's actual policies tend to revolve around foreign economic policy more than anything else. But, that said, the political science on this is pretty clear, which is voters will care about things that actually cause significant redistribution of resources. So, yeah, tariffs would matter a little bit. Maybe defense spending would matter a little bit. Immigration, yeah, I suppose. But I mean, I don't think it's Trump that's made. I guess you could argue what's interesting is that Trump sort of attacked the neoliberal consensus, and that neoliberal consensus is dead. And you can argue that in that way, Trump is the William Jennings Bryan of the 21st century. But beyond that, I don't know. I think the other question is it depends on how the election plays out. It is whether or not that message is considered a vindication or in the end a repudiation.
Great, thank you. Well, not last, the food has arrived.
Great. So please join us for lunch. If you have any questions about the Russia and Eurasia Program or the Eurasia Club at Fletcher, you're welcome to ask us. And please join me in a round of applause for Professors Miller.